Hey friends, it's Just the Gems. I'm Brandon. So, who likes to cry? I do. I mean, look, it's messy. It can sometimes even be embarrassing, but there's something therapeutic about a good cry. As a story lover, I'm in the market for good stories. It's not like I'm some sort of masochist that wants games to punch me in the gut and leave me an emotional wreck, but sometimes telling a good story requires twisting the knife and really leaving your audience in shambles. And we pay them money to do this to us. What's wrong with us as a society? Anyway, I want to look at the JRPGs with the saddest stories today, and there will be some light spoilers, so feel free to use the timeline below to skip around and avoid any games that you're planning to play. But otherwise, settle in and let's reminisce about these things that make us sad. Oh, but before we begin, would you consider subscribing if you're not already? My wife told me that if I get to 10,000 subscribers before the end of the year, she'll finally introduce me to her family, and I would love to not have to spend Christmas dinner waiting alone in the car. 20 years of loneliness finally coming to an end. Oh, and if you like the video, would you click like for me? It helps so much. Thank you. All right, let's get on with it. This one might seem pretty obvious, yeah? I mean, it's called Crystar. The developers are pretty much labeling it as sad game that will make you cry, which puts a lot of pressure on it, actually. If it wasn't sad, if you didn't cry, then you have a case of false advertising on your hands. Disclaimer, if you did not cry while playing Crystar, please do not sue Furyu. The preceding statements were meant to be satirical. Anyway, Crystar is an emotional experience from start to finish. It's the story of Rei, a girl who finds herself transported along with her little sister Mirai into purgatory. While there, Rei accidentally causes Mirai to fall to her death. Now, Rei's only chance to bring her sister back to life is to sign a contract with some demons who want her to clean up the scum in purgatory. Naturally, Rei agrees because otherwise we wouldn't have a game, just a real bummer of a short story. Along the way, Rei teams up with some other women who have similarly tragic stories. There's Kokoro, a college student who lost her unborn baby to a rogue demon. There's Sen, the lone survivor of a terrible bus accident that killed her mother. And there's Nanana, who doesn't seem to have a super sad backstory initially, but like, you know one's coming, right? The game has primed you to expect that. So like, the setup is already sad enough, right? Everybody's dealing with some sort of personal tragedy that's left them with no choice but to team up with demons, and that's never a good situation to be in. But somehow, things just keep getting worse for these ladies. Their friendships are tested as they're put through the ringer over and over again, and as more information about what's really going on gets revealed, it becomes clear that the chances of any of them getting a happy ending are incredibly slim, let's say. And like, there's a dog in this game, the dog is great, but with a story like this, I mean, you're expecting something's gonna happen to the dog, right? It's Chekhov's gun, man. If you introduce a very good dog in Act 1, something terrible has to happen to that dog in Act 3. It's the rules of writing. Crystar is one of my favorite game stories because despite all the sadness and angst that pervade the entire story, there's still always an element of hope there, just barely visible. Plus, it manages to balance the dark and heavy story with moments of levity, just like any good story would, and that keeps it from being painful to play. I'm avoiding the late game spoilers that are even sadder here because I really think you should give this game a shot. It lives up to its name and then some. Did you know there are people out there who don't like Final Fantasy 15? I know, I was shocked too. For me, Final Fantasy 15 was one of the most anticipated games of my entire life. There was so much build up to this game, from its original reveal as Final Fantasy Versus 13 to its eventual repackaging as Final Fantasy 15 proper, and even then there were years and years before we'd even see a playable demo, let alone the actual release. It finally brought the series into a modern setting. Well, modern in big quotes, because I mean, there are cars, and the people dress more or less like us, or us if we were all dressed like background dancers in a My Chemical Romance music video. One of the biggest issues I've heard people had with Final Fantasy 15 was the story. Specifically, the fact that so much of the story happens off screen, and our characters don't actually get to experience it firsthand. It's a fair criticism in a way, but one that I feel misses the point. And this is part of what makes Final Fantasy 15 such a sad story. Final Fantasy XV is ostensibly the story of Noctis, a prince who is on a road trip with his best friends who are taking him to his wedding ceremony with the ruler of another nation. It's a political marriage, but the two of them have a shared history, so I don't get the impression Noctis is actually mad about it. But shortly after their trip begins, a series of tragedies befalls their nation. Noctis' father is killed, the kingdom is overrun, and the world is basically thrown into turmoil. Throughout their journey, Noctis is left pretty much in the dark, never getting a chance to defend the people he cares about, never even getting a moment to mourn in peace. Even his friends aren't immune from tragedy, as they all experience their fair share of trauma on the journey as well. But the most emotional aspect of the story to me is the steadfastness of their friendship. These characters are the best friends that any characters in a Final Fantasy have ever been. Maybe even beyond Final Fantasy. Their love and support for each other is just absolutely beautiful, and seeing that come to fruition throughout the story all the way to its end is heart-melting in the best way. The final scenes of this game play on repeat in my head to this day, and I can only wish that I had the capacity to tell a story with this much weight. Despite what you may have heard, it's a moving experience from start to finish. I love it. I looked through my old high school yearbooks to confirm, and it turns out my assumption was correct. I was never a Japanese high school girl, and yet, somehow, I still vibed with Blue Reflection super well. The way this game is presented, it really grounds you in its setting. You can really truly feel the environment, which goes a long way towards settling you into your role. And that role is to fill the ballet slippers of one Hinako Shirai, a girl who lived to dance, until she suddenly couldn't anymore. See, just prior to the start of the game, Hinako suffers a knee injury, severe enough that she's basically guaranteed never to dance again. Which is an extra big letdown because she'd kind of put all her eggs in the dancing basket. Now Hinako is just gliding through life without any purpose. When school starts up, she sits in the back of the class and doesn't want to interact with anyone. But naturally, she's one of the chosen, and she becomes a magical girl called a reflector. While in her reflector form, she's not burdened by her injury, and she's even more physically capable than she'd been before. But even then, she can't run around as a magical girl in her day-to-day life, so what good is that to her? She can't compete. Superpowers are a disqualifier, almost certainly. Her fellow reflectors are the citrus twins, Yuzu and Lime, and they know a whole lot more about what's going on than Hinako does. And because Hinako is so reluctant to take on the mantle of reflector, they tell her that if she helps them succeed in their mission, she'll be able to have any wish granted. Now this gets Hinako's attention. And so she joins them on their quest to stop the Sephiroth, these massive and terrifying ancient creatures who are coming one by one to destroy the world. Of course, maybe you've picked up on this from the way I framed it, but Yuzu and Lime aren't exactly being 100% forthcoming. Blue Reflection's sadness comes from the pointed and poignant way it shows how personal injury and loss can lead to a life unraveling. What Hinako needs is a supportive group of friends and family to lift her up, not people who will use her loss to manipulate her into doing what they want. It's a sad story further heightened by the melancholy mood of the game as a whole, and the entire thing is a meditation on the best and worst ways to deal with loss. Even if it doesn't make you cry, it will definitely make you think, and that might be even better. I'm combining the next two entries into one because while they couldn't look more different on the surface, they're both extremely similar in one key way. They're both prequels. Their respective previous games, Final Fantasy VII and Lufia and the Fortress of Doom, give us a small snippet of the story of these two prequels, just enough to provide us the necessary context. In Final Fantasy VII, we see Zack and Cloud escape from Nibelheim together, followed quickly by Zack's tragic death on the hill overlooking Midgar. In the original Lufia, we see Maxim and his party's epic defeat of the evil Sinistrals, followed by the tearful parting of Maxim and Salon from the rest of the group. We're not able to feel anything for these sad ends because we haven't been given any reason to feel sad. Feeding us the tragedy at the end of their story is merely a lever the writers are pulling in order to convey something else in the main story. And that's all well and good, it's a perfectly valid lever to pull. But when we delve into the realm of prequel, especially prequels where the end is both A, known, and B, tragic, it takes a special kind of storytelling magic to stick the landing. See, by giving us the full context surrounding Zack's life, his friendship with Angeal, his relationship with Aerith, we can no longer see Zack's death on the hilltop overlooking Midgar as a lever to be pulled in the greater Final Fantasy VII story. Similarly, by showing us Maxim and Salon's story, their meeting, their romance, the beginning of their family together, They're no longer simple pawns whose destinies exist solely to motivate the heroes in another story. Their story becomes our story. Recontextualizing these stories makes them hurt. And somewhat paradoxically, I think it hurts even worse when you know what's coming. The inevitability of their end becomes something that we psychologically fight against, even though we know it's a pointless battle to fight. Zack is going to die on that hill because if he doesn't, Final Fantasy VII doesn't happen. Maxim and Celan are going to die in that fortress because if they don't, Lufia 1 doesn't happen. Unless we're about to delve into the realm of alternate timelines, and there's something to be said for that approach, don't get me wrong, then we have to accept the sad end. And that's just not an easy thing to do. Seeing a game in the Tales of series on a list like this might be a little surprising. After all, the Tales of games tend toward the lighthearted. But Tales of Berseria is dark, heavy, full of melodrama and angst, the likes of which the series had never seen. In my opinion, it was a much needed shot in the arm, and it helped keep the series from falling too far down into a rut. Berseria tells the story of Velvet, a young woman who faced tragedy at a young age. She and her little brother were saved from a horde of demons by her brother-in-law, Artorias. That same attack unfortunately killed her older sister and her unborn nephew. Several years later, Velvet is caring for her younger brother who has been sickly for a long time. Another demon attack occurs, but this time, instead of saving them, Artorias sacrifices Velvet's brother to cause something called the Advent. He tries to kill Velvet too, but instead she ends up fusing with a demon and becoming something called a Therian, a creature that can absorb demonic powers. Tales of Berseria is a story about revenge. Revenge is something almost always born out of a deep sadness, and the betrayal that Velvet faces is one of the saddest plots I've seen in a video game. You as the player get a sense that there's some greater purpose behind Artorias' betrayal, that maybe he's a more complicated antagonist than most, and that he may just be trying to do what he thinks is best for the world. But since we're playing through Velvet's eyes, it's clear that his reasons don't matter to her. That betrayal was absolute. It was soul-crushing. She's reached the point where she'll stop at nothing to kill him for it. As layers of the story get peeled away and as everyone's motivations come to light, it makes the betrayal even more complex and somehow even sadder. And what Velvet ends up having to ultimately do leads to one of the most poignant endings I've seen in a JRPG. Yes, it's a little on the grimdark side, but if you can stomach a heavy and powerful story, I recommend you give Berseria a try. Final Fantasy X is such a lighthearted game on the surface. It's mostly tropical sunshine and blitzball and memeable laugh scenes. The idea that there's this deeply sad story at its core is hard to believe. But Final Fantasy X is truly one of the saddest entries in the entire series, and it all comes down to perspective. Throughout the game, you as the player are fully in Tidus' perspective. Yeah, I said Tidus. It's Tida in Japanese. I know, it seems weird, but check the Japanese pronunciation, son. What was I talking about? Oh right, the story is told from Tidus' point of view. The game even famously begins with him narrating, telling everyone to listen to his story because this might be his last chance to tell it. With Tidus as our narrator, we see a bright and colorful world that, yes, is under constant threat of assault from the giant monster known as Sin, but at the very least, it's a world worth saving. He's traveling with a group of friends so that Yuna, the summoner, can pray at each of the temples in the world. And while he might not fully understand the purpose of that, he's along for the ride and supportive. But at a certain point along the way, Tidus learns something that the other characters have known all along. Yuna's ultimate goal is to sacrifice herself to defeat Sin. And that defeat isn't even permanent. Sin will eventually come back, but her death will bring at least a short period of peace to the world. This revelation, again, because we've seen everything from Tidus' perspective, it completely and retroactively changes so many interactions the characters have had throughout the game. The famous laughter scene, while still cringe as heck, reveals itself to be more a desperate attempt by Yuna to hold on to joy as she embarks on a journey that will end her life, just as one example. The whole woman must go and sacrifice herself to save the world thing has become a full-fledged trope by now, but at the time, this was about as hard-hitting as it came. And it all caps off with the conclusion of Tidus' own story, which I'm not ashamed to admit left me in tears as the credits started to roll. By so effectively juxtaposing its environments with its carefully guarded secrets, Final Fantasy X crushes our expectations and makes us feel, well, just a whole lot of feelings. contrary to Tales of Berseria, a game like Omori being on this list is a no-brainer. While it's essentially a horror game take on the Earthbound aesthetic, it breaks new ground in storytelling by bringing us what my friend Mungunzu called in his review of the game a sobering yet whimsical meditation on grief and escapism, which, if you're anything like me, is one of the best ways to sell me on a game. There's a link to his review in the description, by the way, go check it out. Anyway, Omori is the story of a little boy who spends most of his time in white space, a completely empty world where nothing happens. From time to time, a door appears and he emerges into a world called Headspace, where he goes on magical adventures with his friends Kel, Hiro, Basil, Aubrey, and his older sister Mari. Eventually, though, those adventures end for the day, and suddenly Omori finds himself waking up. Now he's no longer Omori, he's Sunny, a teenager who has refused to leave his house for years. He and his mother are in the process of moving away, and in fact, she's not at the house right now. She's off in their new town getting things squared away. Sunny's old friend Kel has been coming by and wanting to talk to him, but Sunny has refused to see him. By this point in the game, we're getting a good sense of what's going on. Sunny is burying some trauma deep in his subconscious. It's kept him housebound for years, and most of his time is spent in his own head, imagining fun adventures with his friends. The game gives you the freedom to determine how Sunny's story plays out. You can ignore the real world, stay in bed, and continue your imaginary adventures for as long as you want. But to progress toward the true ending of the story, you have to drag Sunny out of bed, out of the house, and help him face reality. What is the reality that's kept Sunny locked away? Well, for the sake of any extreme spoilers or upsetting conversations, I'll just leave that vague. Suffice to say, this is a story about grief, so do with that as you will. The whimsy in the fantasy world helps to provide you with the necessary oxygen to get through the heaviness of the story in the real world, but at the end of the day, this is still one of the saddest and most profoundly moving stories I've experienced in a video game. If you can stomach the subject matter, then I highly recommend it. Well, that's all for now. Any other super sad stories you think I should check out for inclusion in some future super sad list of sadness? Let me know down in the comments. Once again, if you wouldn't mind subscribing if you're not already, and if you would like the video, that would mean so much to me. Also, if you're watching this when it launches in August of 2024, I wanted to let you all know that I'll be appearing at PAX West at the end of the month. I'm participating in a panel on the power of stories in JRPGs being put on by NIS America. It's at 2 p.m. Pacific time on August 30th at the Blue Dragon Theater in the Summit Building. I'll put a link in the description. If you're gonna be at PAX, come by and say hi, and if not, the panel will be streamed and recorded for posterity, so give it a watch. Anyway, with all that, I'll see you next time. Bye. Even his friends aren't immune from tragedy, as they all experience their fair share. That's the one. That's the take. You're a good tuber, Brandon. You're a good tuber.